Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Reimagining Prevention, the Structural Wellbeing Framework with the Haywood Burns Institute. This webinar is a series brought to you by CDSS, Safety Prevention and Early Intervention Branch, Strategies TA, and Caltran, California Training Institute. So before we get started, we just wanted everyone who is here today to introduce themselves in the chat. So in the chat, if you could please share your name, the county that you work in, and also the native land that you're joining us from. The website is below on the slide, and it's also been shared in the chat. I'm joining you today from Tongva land. Also today, just to let you be aware of some of the features of Zoom. You'll be able to share your camera if you would like. So there's the camera icon there. Also below on your control panel, you'll see a microphone. Everyone is muted, and that is to allow us to really cut out any background noise. We will have a Q&A session at the end, and so we'll have an opportunity to ask questions at that time and unmute ourselves. If you need help or you wanted to share a thought with the crowd, please feel free to use the chat box. If you need help with any of the settings or anything like that, you are free to chat any of us with a strategies background. Also, please hold all of your questions till the end. We don't want them to get lost in the chat. We have a lot of folks participating today, so we just ask that you wait until that time so that we're able to see all of the questions for our presenters today. So just a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded and it will be posted on our strategies website as well as on our strategies YouTube. You can access the presentation slides. We will load those into the chat for those that need them. A follow-up email will be sent to all of you by the end of the week that will have all of the links to everything that has been shared. And at the end of this webinar today, we are going to ask that you please complete a brief survey that will help inform us of future webinars to come. So I wanted us to just take a few minutes to talk a little bit about the Reimagining Prevention series and a little bit more about why we are doing this. So joining us now is Hillary Conrad from Safety Prevention and Early Intervention Branch, and I will let her share.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Hillary Conrad, as Lydia mentioned. Thank you for that. And welcome to the second webinar within our Reimagining Prevention series. As Lydia mentioned, I'm with the Safety Prevention and Early Intervention Branch of the California Department of Social Services. And I wanted to remind everyone that we have a vision to create an integrated statewide system to reach families sooner, to build strong local prevention networks to strengthen not only families, but communities and prevent child maltreatment and entry into child and family serving systems. We strive to make it happen by building capacity of community partners, joining with others around a common goal of child and family well-being, and starting to look at the larger landscape of services being offered across private and public agencies. The goal of this series is really to bring all the players of prevention work to the table to learn about key foundational principles of prevention and start to reimagine the way we are committing, coordinating, and investing in prevention work. Another goal of this series is for a diverse audience to come together to learn prevention principles such as utilizing an equity lens and engaging with community when developing, planning, and implementing prevention work. This series will provide information and ways for agencies to move upstream towards primary prevention to support and strengthen families, with the ultimate goal for all of us to work together, break down silos, and develop a comprehensive continuum of prevention services that includes primary, secondary, and tertiary strategies and interventions grounded in fairness and equity. For the first time, federal legislation has provided state agencies the opportunity to leverage Title IV funds to shift to an upstream approach to serve children and families, and to start thinking differently about when and how we engage with families and the quality of services we are delivering. At the state level, we are currently planning for the implementation of the Family First Prevention Services Act Part 1, which is federal legislation that states can choose to opt into to deliver evidence-based services to individuals that are at imminent risk of entering into foster care. These services will be provided to families that are involved with child welfare and probation, but will keep the families intact and the children at home. California wanted to build upon the opportunity of the legislation and moved even more upstream. The Reimagining Prevention series is centered on Assembly Bill 153, which builds upon the Family First Prevention Services Act by offering additional funding and requires counties and their partners to develop a comprehensive plan that includes primary, secondary, and tertiary strategies. Development of the comprehensive plan will require change, collaboration with community providers, other public agencies, tribes, individuals with lived expertise, and other key partners. This webinar today and the others in the series will be a primer and a way for community partners and county agencies to start thinking about how their agency may fit into the larger goal of developing a comprehensive plan. This last slide, which you will see at the beginning of every webinar, and we'll go into an in-depth review of it during the next webinar on March 30th. This slide provides an overview of the journey and the process that we envision collaborative teams will walk through to implement their comprehensive plan. We understand that some agency teams will be more ready since they've already been completing their own cross-sector work through AB 2083 system of care work, or through prevention work such as the cross-sector prevention planning teams being supported by Strategies TA. And other counties will just be starting to flex their prevention muscles. So the 4 pillars at the bottom represent the types of phases we've defined to understand the levels of readiness for implementing a comprehensive plan. The webinars in this series will support counties and community partners and provide best practices during this planning process. And I just appreciate all of you for being here and hope that you enjoy the webinar today. It's focused on structural well-being, and shared leadership will both be key when developing your comprehensive plans. Have a great webinar.
Thank you so much, Hillary, for giving us that overview of the series and what's to come. Some upcoming events that will be for this Reimagining Prevention series are the Roadmap to Comprehensive Prevention Planning, and this is the one that Hillary just referenced, on March 30th at 10 a.m. There's also going to be a Exploring a Prevention Mindset training on April 19th at 10 a.m., Taking Action, Cultivating Commitment to a Prevention Mindset on May 3rd at 10 a.m., and Leading Through Change, Shifting Towards a Prevention Mindset on May 17th. And these will all be led by Caltrin. So you can find the information on their website, which we will share at the end of this webinar as well. There's also going to be a collective impact community engagement toolkit with Junius Williams. So for those of us that have joined us before, know that Junius has done a few webinars for us, and that will be in May. And then a data and prevention data and prevention webinar that will be coming as well. So now I'm going to hand it over to Samantha Mullerson and Michael Finley from the Haywood Burns Institute, and I will let them share a little bit more about their work and about themselves.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so we'll just do something, we'll just do quick introductions of ourselves and we'll jump in. So Mike Finley with the Burns Institute, we have 3 executive directors. We always mention we're part of a shared leadership model. We think that's just an effective way as we think about how do we do things differently, right? And one of the themes and what you just heard from folks' comments as we enter this space was, right, reimagining. And so for us, even organizationally, how to reimagine leadership and what that looks like. So good to be with you. And I am on the East Coast in North Carolina. So good to be with folks. Yeah.
Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm Samantha Mellerson. I go by Sam. Just letting you all know that I have a dog and I'm not a good dog trainer, so he will bark throughout this, and I will try to minimize that as much as I can. As Mike said, I'm just part of the executive leadership team at the Haywood Burns Institute. Just really a pleasure to be with all of you, and just love to see more and more people tackling this really important work. So just grateful to share space with you all today.
Cool. So what we'll do today, and again, just I think a lot of the comments that were said that Hillary shared and others shared as precursor to our time, kind of really were the introduction, right? We're going to walk you through a framework, our structural well-being framework that we really see as how do we get to reimagination and transformation, right? These are words we all sort of you hear in the news, we're all saying them, but what does it really mean? How do you operationalize that? So kind of to give you some of our walk and what our framework is and how we got to that point. And then spend a little bit of time on radical imagination. What does that look like? What are the seeds for transformation? What's actually happening around the country and the world, right? That regardless of what sector we're in, we should be able to pull from, right, to actually impact what we do. And I'm just reminded when we had our initial call with the planning team for this webinar, and I don't know who said it, but I had it in quotes, and it was around the purpose of this series, which Hillary and the folks just talked about. And part of what someone said was, how can we use this opportunity to do better? And really, so just, I think what was just laid out by Lydia, the series you're involved in, like pull from what we're giving you today. There are things that'll fit perfectly. Those things you'll say, huh, but what we're saying is use these opportunities because we're all trying to get to that place of real transformation and change. And well-being for people, right? Which we have a definition that we'll give you in our presentation. So just want to put that as an outset of where we're trying to go today. And hopefully you'll find it useful. And then like what was shared, please provide your questions, which we'll respond to at the end of our presentation. So we can go to the next slide. So we always bring in the room Haywood Burns, who is our namesake for Haywood Burns Institute. And Haywood was actually a real person. He was a absolute pillar in the civil rights and human rights community as an activist. He was an attorney who represented Black activists in the 60s, like Angela Davis. He was general counsel to Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign and was just a stalwart on issues around race, ethnicity, and just justice for people. And he was a mentor to our founder, James Bell. And we just always, he's one of those names that a lot of people don't know, but he was just one of the many, right, that on whose shoulders we stand, help center us and humble us. Just similar, we do the land acknowledgement, it's really just things to bring us into these spaces and really focus us. And he died a little more than 25 years ago now in South Africa at a human rights conference. And so we actually asked his family if they could use their name, and they gave that to us. And so just something we always bring in the room. So, and just someone you should know of, and hopefully do your own little research on who Haywood was.
And so we wanted to just start off by really introducing you all to this concept of what we call our community-centered structural well-being. This is kind of our North Star in the work that we think that you may call it something different, but this is what we're all working towards, right? And so for us, we define this as a system of public policies, institutional and inclusive practices, cultural representations, and other norms that establish a sense of belonging and work to strengthen families, communities, and individual well-being for positive life outcomes. And so this is kind of that macro level. This is what we hope that all of us are really working towards as we think about closing disparity gaps and really ensuring that folks have what they need to thrive. And the reason we wrote it that way is because it's really in direct contrast to what we have currently. And so this is just a reminder for folks as we think about structural racism and the magnitude of the role that it plays within our societal fabric, is to remember, right, that this is the normalization and the legitimization of an array of dynamics. This includes the history, culture, institutional, interpersonal dynamics, that routinely advantage white people while producing really some chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. But what's important here is to remember that this is the normalization that really binds together these institutions and interlocks them in a way that creates a disproportionate amount of power and control. And so it's important to remember this and hold this as a backdrop as we think about if we are to dismantle this and understand like truly the intricate role it plays in our societal fabric, what do we replace it with? And so this is why we introduce this notion of structural well-being, is to say we want to replace this with something that kind of catches all of us, helps us see each other, celebrate what's good, give folks what they have, what they need to really be able to access opportunities, and just have what they need to thrive. We can't underscore that enough. So just lifting this up is a bit of a reminder to that, and to also just remember this normalization of how sometimes structural racism gets presented in a way that folks have a harder time seeing it when the interpersonal dynamics are very easy to point out. And so this is a frame by which, like, once you see it, you'll never unsee it. And so then we can really focus and begin to dismantle in a very strategic way. And so why we lift up white supremacy culture is because this is actually something that we all have to own, right? We all participate in this, white people as well as people of color. And so part of this is also, we want to like take the bite out of this term. Like, this is not to direct at any particular people. We are the fish that are swimming in this culture, right? And the longer we swim in a culture, the more invisible it becomes. And so this is for all of us to own, all of us to recognize, and to begin to understand it enough to change some of the current cultural practices that we engage in that are producing outcomes that we're trying to turn around. So this is, again, this is really not to separate us. In a strange way, we lift up this term in recognition of white supremacy culture in a way that brings us all together to see how we're all swimming in this water, and we have to do a better job of acknowledging that, recognizing it, and then actively changing our behaviors, choices, policies, and practices. And so we wanted to lift up a little bit of context for folks and why we think this is really important. A lot of people have been writing about and kind of forecasting the changing demographics of America and looking at the where we will get to points of predominantly being a country that is people of color. This is important to note because this does not immediately eliminate the disparities that we see, right? And so as we think about the population changing, it can actually paint a pretty scary picture where you begin to have a smaller and smaller group of people that then have a disproportionate amount of power and control. And thinking about all the ways in which we need to eradicate the disparities that we see, if the country will even be able to be kind of the global powerhouse that it is today, how much of that gets lost if the people that are going to represent the country don't have access to the opportunities that are necessary to really advance the nation.
And Sam, there was a question in the chat. Are
Oh.
those figures are age, right? And I want to confirm.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm sorry, could we shift to the next? Thank you. And so this is, again, just lifting up some of what we currently know. So when we look at the education gaps, and we look at them by race and ethnicity, employment, unemployment. So thinking about how these gaps are so pervasive and the way that they all kind of bleed into each other to paint a very distinct picture. We can go to the next one. Again, with health disparities, we know we've seen, and we've, the last 2 years of us kind of seeing this on a major platform within a global pandemic has also been really striking for folks. So really, again, looking at the ways in which disparities illustrate themselves. And we can go to the next. And again, really importantly, the wealth gap, right? So we're looking at income, the massive disparities there. And really, again, this top 1%, like this small group of elites that really hold a disproportionate amount of wealth, which we know determines a lot of power in decision-making. So all things to just really consider as we think about the urgency of the work, and especially as the demographics continue to shift. So part of what's important to recognize too is like this notion of othering, right? And so as you think about how structural racism, that macro level, how it's able to strengthen and maintain and morph, right, over time. Some of the tactical approaches that are used that sometimes we're not even paying attention to. One of them is lifting up this notion of othering. And I'm sorry, the Haas, they're not the Haas Institute anymore, Mike. What is?
They're
John
othering
Powell.
and belonging, isn't it?
Othering and belonging.
Yeah, othering and
Okay.
belonging.
So just want to pay those respects to John Powell and his team that have really developed this Othering and Belonging Institute, which have great materials to read. But this notion of othering and how we've all kind of experienced this in different ways. And so when you hear it in a defined term like this, a generalized set of common processes that denies someone's full humanity based on them being less than or a threat to the favored group, that can sound really extreme. But this can actually show up in very simplistic ways. So when you think about even our own experiences where you've maybe been the new member to join a team, right? And there's kind of this collective that exists, but you're that outsider and you know that you're not quite that group, right? You're not there yet and you're trying to figure that out. Many of us see it with our children when they start school, different things like that. This notion of othering, it can show up in the most simplistic ways. Even when you travel, you may not realize or ever think that you have an accent. It's everyone else that has an accent until you go to a place where suddenly everyone's stopping you saying, oh, where are you from? You're not from here. Clearly you're not from here. You have an accent. And you're still thinking in your mind, no, I don't have an accent. They all have an accent, right? And it's this notion, it's this thing of othering that we do that that can easily kind of distance ourselves from other people, right? Not quite being able to feel the connection to someone based on our differences. And so what's important to lift up, and what John Powell does a brilliant job of stating, is we're not saying that in order to get past that, we all have to be the same. It's like the opposite of othering is this notion of belonging, right? It's appreciating those differences, not feeling that tension between or distance from, but really to be able to set a tone where we almost like bring each other into that, to celebrate that, to appreciate that, to learn from each other. And so really just want to lift this up because the tool of othering has been used in our society for a very long time, and it shows up in many different ways, some of which we'll talk about a little bit today, but really encourage folks to think about how that can show up and how sometimes maybe we have to do the work to check ourselves to say, okay, just because that's different doesn't mean that it's bad. Let's figure this out and let's get to a place where we can truly like appreciate a better solution, one that's collective and comes from diverse perspectives.
So that backdrop that Tim just walked through, right, and we talk about this is coming from structural racism then manifest in these different ways, right? When we look at disparities around employment, economics, education, health, all the different things, right, that we know are sort of these ills we're trying to address in some ways in our work. That's the context for the Burns Institute when we've worked for 2 decades, more than 2 decades, on racial justice reform efforts, right? And I just want to give you a sense of sort of what we kept bumping into is what we call these 4 conundrums. Our founder, James, who we love dearly, calls them conundrums. We barriers, right? Barriers, but these consistent themes that in doing the work we do, and probably in a lot of what you all do, right, we kept bumping into. So we can move to the next slide. So the first, and again, so this is from 2 decades of working across the country, working with folks, and really listening, right? Taking in, what do we hear from folks? What are we experiencing? So first is, right, if we're trying to address racial and ethnic disparities, right, this whole idea, this conundrum of negotiating the principle that justice, and you can use justice, big J, having big J in this example, like not just justice system, but justice, the concept is colorblind and race neutral, thereby negating the necessity to address policies and practices that reflect racialized social control. So often this becomes the, hey, I don't really see color, I don't see ethnicity, but you know, we have tools, right? Technologies that are race neutral. And I'm not saying that all of those things are bad, but it's saying that sometimes they can also be, they have been workarounds to having the harder, more challenging conversations, right? So this is that first conundrum. You can go to the next slide. This second point around investment, right? So investment in communities that most populate the justice sector, and really any sectors we're talking about, is outside the sector's purview, right? So disinvestment is a structural issue that is larger than the justice sector or any sector can handle alone. I think the way to think of this for all of us, right, in whatever work we're doing, those disparities that Sam referenced in those initial slides, if you, in any county you are in California, outside of California, right, there are places where we see these ills disproportionately. And those places are disproportionately places that have been disinvested or were never invested in the first place. So for us to address the root causes, for us to actually get to reimagining, for us to actually get to transformation, right, we have to actually navigate this conundrum, right? This is one of the issues we kept bumping into, and people weren't leaning into it. So we saw this as a second conundrum that we were trying to address in our work now. Go to the next slide. And these next two deal with sort of government and how government's structured. So number 3 is, right, government is not structured to promote flexible cross-sector responses to complex human services problems that involve public safety or involve any issues where we're trying to support folks. Just very simply, right, government, bureaucracy is not naturally structured to be flexible. So we often leave meetings and spaces where we're like, there's this funding siloed over here, there's this funding siloed over here. It'd be wonderful if we could braid them together, right? But often that's not what happens, right? And so just understanding the initial limitations of government that we have to really think about how do we address those that lack of flexibility. And then and for all of you, as you do your work and you're looking at the Family First Act and how you using these funds differently and trying to reimagine systems and how the child welfare system will function, period, and doing that work, there's always the challenge of elected and appointed officials. There is not often an incentive, a natural incentive for them to play well together in the sandbox and to share power, right? So it's often difficult for elected and appointed officials to share power with each other and the communities most in need of those human service interventions, right? And so what I just walked you through is 4 sort of points, conundrums or barriers that we consistently saw and experienced in our work. You can go to the next one, you're good, thank you. And I'm just gonna take a second to read this quote, because I think it's worth reading. And again, think of justice broader than the justice sector, but the concept, the notion of justice. The persistent and seeming intractable nature of race and ethnicity in the justice apparatus presents significant dangers for communities of color. Genuine and lasting solutions for change require deep dives into the local, institutional, and community cultural norms that affect each local justice apparatus. It's in this space beyond data that the BI's new agenda is engaging. And so our structural well-being framework comes out of those barriers that we kept bumping into and really understanding we needed to go deeper, right? And that a lot of our work was based in sort of classic traditional reform, and that reform has limitations. And where we are now pushing with our well-being framework is to say we actually want to see transformation, not in just the language and the word, but the reality, right? So this map is one we use. So people are always like, give us the thing, like what's the magic thing, like the roadmap, like what is it? And and we're gonna take you through some of these pieces conceptually to walk you through, but to understand, this roadmap engages a whole bunch of different important points, right? Historical competence, building trust, sharing values, having awareness of structural racism, power sharing, right? Radical imagination. So we'll take you through these pieces, but wanted to just give you a visual, because I think the point for us is, as you hear us talk about this framework, is to really pull out how do we operationalize this? It's not just saying the words, we want to reimagine a system, but what does it actually look like? And we found these are many of the key components we think are critical to how we actually get there.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. So even seeing that roadmap laid out and moving into this discussion around mental models is interesting, because like Mike said, initially people just said, oh, show us the roadmap, tell us what we need to do, because we just want to get there, we want to do it. And so, when you think about getting to a place of racial and ethnic equity and inclusion, that's not a place that we've ever been before, right? And so when we were trying to figure out even how to demonstrate this in a more linear way for folks, it's important to recognize that it's helpful to see it laid out that way. But a lot of this is about actually rewiring how we approach things, right? Rewiring our thought process. And so when we talk about mental models, which is, I have to just say, we're hearing this more and more come up, this notion of mental models across like human service sectors. But it's so fascinating that as someone, like my entire career has been in some kind of human service, this was never something that we really dove into. We did not really dissect our mental models and our approaches to the work. And yet when you look at Fortune 500 companies and various like corporate sectors, it's all about mental models and practice, right? And so it's just fascinating that this is not something that we all centered ourselves in. Broadly, let me say, I'm sure there are some folks on here that know this and know this well, but I certainly didn't before. And so a mental model is really an explanation of our thought process and how we understand the world around us. It guides our perceptions and our behaviors, what assumptions, beliefs, and values do we hold? And we have to ask ourselves, like, what do we hold that is actually keeping the current construct in place? Because there are so many of us working towards change, and yet we're having such a hard time shifting there, right? So what is it that we actually believe that may be anchoring some of this? And it's important that we understand this and how it connects to the current constructs, because we have to reprogram how we approach these things. And the beauty about mental models is once we begin to really dive in and look at how we process information and how we think about it, what values do we hold, like really that are guiding some of our behaviors and beliefs, it's actually very easy to change that, right? So this is kind of the one area of our brain that when you know better, you do better. We can actually pull it apart and re-engineer how we think about these things and come up with very different solutions. So it's a great space to play. Let's say that. We can move to the next. And so, you know what? I made this an animated slide, which is really annoying. So you can just hit all of them so they come up. I think it, yeah, just keep going. I'm so sorry. Thank you. Oh, okay, there you go, thanks. So part of this is the Iceberg. It's a tool that's used for guiding systemic thinking. And it's actually really useful. And so we wanted to share it as folks, because we do think beginning to examine our own mental models is a part of this work. It's a part of our tapping into our radical imagination and really coming up with different solutions and outcomes and strategies. So just to walk you through quickly, it's, you know, when you think about the iceberg, it's that event, right? The thing that happened that's above the water, we all see it. It may be something that was newsworthy, it caught our attention. There's that thing that happens. And then we look just underneath that, right, at the patterns and the trends, like what trends have there been over time? And we can begin to look at those patterns and understand, okay, why is this happening, right? So we dig a little deeper. That's getting at those underlying structures. So what has influenced these patterns? What are the relationships between the moving parts? And then really digging down and looking at our mental models. What are the assumptions, beliefs, and values that we hold about the system that is keeping this very system in place, right? And so as a really quick example, sometimes, you know, when we think about the human service sector, it could be that the thing that's happening is, you know, we're catching colds, right? We're not feeling well. We may be just demonstrating some illness. When we look at the patterns, it could be that, you know, at the end of the fiscal year, this is kind of what happens. Like we're kind of getting sick at these times. And well, what's underneath that? Well, maybe it's we're writing a bunch of reports at the end of the year. We're looking at all of our data. We're writing grants. We're really kind of pushing our ability to like really show up in service because we are really grinding at a particular time. Sometimes when we think about our mental models, we have to reckon with, okay, I know these behaviors are not healthy, right? I know I'm maybe overworking, not eating well. I'm trying to meet these deadlines. I'm not sleeping, but I'm pushing myself because I care so much about this work, right? And yet, if we care so much about service of people, we know that we can't serve from a place of deficit, right? We can really only serve from a place of overflow. We have to be well in order to show up in partnership with people and in service. And so the mental model may have to shift from being one that is maybe, you know, me working this way kind of defines who I am in my career. It shows that I really, you know, care about this work. Maybe it's shifting that to actually say, you know, I have to be well in order to really be of service to other people in this way. I have to create some limitations so that I can be grounded and really be of service and serve from a place of overflow. I lift that up because I think a lot of us fall into those traps, and we may not even realize that there's an undercurrent, right? There's a value that we're holding that is actually keeping a practice that we don't like in place, and one that's actually making us unhealthy, right? And so I lift it up because it's that this is the genius of structural racism as well, right? Where we can participate in stuff that we know we do not like the outcome and we don't like the process, but there's something under there that has us believing this is the way we're supposed to do this, right? And so it's being able to dive in and really start picking apart what is at the root of some of our beliefs that we may have to address and change. And again, just remembering, like, white supremacy culture and structural racism, there is an evil genius to that design. So there's no shame in realizing, oh man, I've been contributing to this. It's just getting to the point of seeing it so that we can begin to unpack it and change so that we can produce something very different. We can go to the next.
And to give you an example, right, of just what this looks like in practice, and this is a different context, but it should be close to home for many of you. So Ramsey County, which is St. Paul, Minnesota, is one of the places we're working in to actually engage exactly this process, right? To go down that road that we highlighted earlier. And what they have done, so big picture, what they've done is they no longer are, the prosecutor, the district, the county attorney is no longer accepting cases where the charge is based on pretextual stops. And so just understand pretextual stops are what led to George Floyd, what led to Philando Castile, and a lot of the violence from law enforcement against Black men and Latino men that we saw around the country, that we've seen historically, right? But those pretextual stops are a big part of that. They're also constitutional. And so what Ramsey County did was, in going through a process where they explored the things we were talking about, they explored mental models, they made this shift. So this is their language, right? The traditional notion of public safety achieved through deterrent, conflict managed through force or threat of force. And their articulated shift as part of the cross-sector group is public wellness and safety achieved through connection and social fabric, conflict managed by civilians and communities. So when Sam is talking about the mental models and like, hey, there's this thing we do where we all kind of know like this isn't where we want to go, but then we kind of do it. It is really a pause point to say, well, why is that okay? And what they did in Ramsey was stop themselves. They made this. So this is the policy change that I started with is big, but it's honestly what is even more powerful is that the county attorney's office, working with a cross-sector of folks, articulated this as an actual shift that they will moving forward. Now, please understand, it does not mean everything is suddenly perfect with the prosecutor's office in Ramsey County. But when we talk about this is a process, these are steps, this is a really great example of what transformation or change or reimagining can look like. And they didn't do it in one meeting. It was a process, right? Because it really takes a digging into your own, like, why is this how we do what we do? Let's explore this. When we think about prevention and how we define prevention, right? How do we define that? How can we do this better, differently, to benefit those on whose behalf we work? So just really wanted to just sit with that for a second, because these are these moments, I think, that are really, we found to be really important, and just really want you all to hear when we're saying mental models, not just a concept, but this is what it looks like in practice and actual change in a place that's engaging this work. And it's hard work, you know, it's a process.
Yeah, and Mike, maybe actually when we talk about even a values-driven process, coming back to that Ramsey example would be really great, and how they even got there, because it is really a big deal. And I almost feel when you talk about pretextual stops and stuff, it can almost like land flat, but it really is transformational. So a lot of times, guys, we've heard a lot of the social determinants of health, right? And just what a kind of a brilliant way that health was able to, as a sector, kind of address these root causes of inequities. And almost like I felt at the time, kind of tackling structural racism without even naming race, right? And so people kind of jumped on it. When we heard about social determinants of health, it was no longer, your health outcome is because you decided to eat poorly and you drank this, and now these are your health outcomes. It was actually looking away from one person's individual decisions and really looking at the hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions that are made for a person prior to that person ever making a decision, right? And being able to see it that way. So what we wanted to do is really share that concept and think about it really across sectors. And so we left this as social determinants that this could be of prevention. We use it a lot in the context of justice. But in any way that you look at it, it's like really understanding social determinants, right? Are the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, age. This is all of us. And these circumstances are shaped by the distribution of money, power, influence, and resources at global, national, and local levels, which we know there are huge disparities in terms of where investments are made and where chronic disinvestment can happen over time. And so these are designed to perpetuate structural racism and protect the racial caste system in America. These determinants act as both feeders of mass incarceration and other ills because they're devourers of opportunity for social, emotional, and familial well-being. And so this is why we look at, when we talk about structural well-being, it's really being able to understand the social determinants that we all know are at play are really rooted in the very thing that we're trying to disrupt and dismantle, right? And understanding the connection to those root causes is the only way we really get to a true prevention. I'm so bad at looking at the chat, but I just saw boom. So whoever put that in, you just gave me life with that. That's so dope. I love that. And so here's another example of kind of shifting mental models, right? And so Mike gave one with the state attorney's office in Ramsey County. This is another one that we've been engaging with a lot of community groups. And it's this notion of community safety and public safety. And when you talk to groups about this, it's so interesting to see that community safety is actually very distinct and defined differently than how we think about public safety, right? And so we have to reconcile that difference and really come together as a collective community to almost redefine how we consider these notions of public safety. And so we were asking many of the community groups participating, what is it that makes us feel safe? Because that is what probably should determine our public safety approach, right? And so the things that make us feel safe is really having that sense of belonging, nurturing relationships, right? Community and connection, a safe physical environment, like all the things that all of us, I'm sure, share in. These are the things that make us feel safe. And yet when we think about kind of the way that these structures are placed and that the larger macro system in which we all operate, is we have a system of public safety that's actually anchored in fear and violence. And that's the opposite of what we just said make us feel safe, right? So it's a complete contradiction. And yet fear, what we know is used as the most effective weapon for manipulation, is really used to promote this notion of public safety that allows us to accept these violent strategies of racialized social control and surveillance, right, in the name of keeping us all safe. And we think about how this spreads off into other sectors. We could say the same for child welfare. We can look at the various ways that surveillance is used as social control in the name of safety, because that fear is such a strong weapon for manipulation that it almost distracts us from the very things that we know actually make us feel whole, make us feel safe, make us feel part of a community, keep a family feeling strong, supported. It's the complete opposite. And yet these narratives are so strong that they allow us to almost turn the blind eye to some of the things that we know are in direct contrast to the things that we actually want to see as our outcomes.
Yeah, so then you can press one more time, just so we can save the
Yeah, I got on this animation thing, guys. It was so bad. I've destroyed all of our slides.
You're good. You're good. We don't need to surprise y'all. No, and so this is one of the ways we describe our work, right? And what this does for us is it acknowledges that harm reduction. And I want to be really clear. We're not saying harm reduction, traditional formwork is a bad thing. That's not the point, right? What we're really trying to say is that for us, it's insufficient. Like we have to get to this next level, right? And so and have that work be anchored in well-being, right, at the center, and strengthening communities, okay? And so when you look at this, there's a couple of things. So one, on that top left, you see historical context is key. We're going to touch on that again in a few slides. But we think it's just really important that that groups have an understanding of how we got here. And I've been using, and I like this analogy, so hopefully I can't see y'all, but you'll like it. Because there's this thing, people get real frustrated with, why do we gotta know what that was? When that was 1600, 1700, 1800, 1900. But any of you who ever bought a car, or you bought a house, or you bought anything that was relevant to you, right? You wanna know this history, something about that history. And so it's the same thing. It's the same concepts, folks, right? Like, we shouldn't leave spaces being like, well, why are we not concerned about that, okay? And so so this is just, the reason we have that up there is it's a critical piece of what we need to do. And you can also see how siloed this becomes, right? So prevention is separate from harm reduction, and it's separate from structural well-being. And where we're really trying to go is that our fundamental belief is that we work through the strategic piece of this. We work through this continuum and get past our limitations and really reimagine. Then the work we will all be doing to get towards structural well-being actually becomes your prevention strategy. So when we work through the deepest ends of these systems and fully understand the root causes and the issues that we know, are the core issues we need to address, and we actually take the time to navigate and address those core root issues, that becomes our prevention strategy, our natural prevention strategy. And that helps us get out of these silos that we've existed in for so long. Sam, I know you want to jump in.
Yeah, I just want to just really stress on that slide. If we could just go back just for 1 second, because I feel like we can't stress this enough, especially when we're in groups with folks that are working on prevention. The reason we map out this continuum in this way is because we know that this is how the work is currently siloed. And we believe that we have got to completely obliterate these silos in order to get to a space of real prevention. And so as Mike was kind of walking through, everything, the way that our work is organized, anything in the human sector is divided this way. So if you look at resources, grants, partnerships, various things in community and how folks get access to different resources to serve populations, it's usually done in these silos, right? Well, if you're prevention, out of school time programs, enrichment, social emotional development, all these things that are great that everybody needs across this continuum, but they're really positioned in this front end. And then we have these harm reduction strategies that are once a system has touched a young person, suddenly they're no longer that kid in community. They're not considered that. They're in this different bucket that now they can access certain things that are very different and not as grounded in some of the front end prevention programs. And so what we're trying to say is our funding streams and the way that we are organized and our various approaches to the work are all distinct and siloed, but the children and families that we serve are the same. And so we have got to break these down in a way that truly understands what is going on with children and families, understand those root causes, and really start to shift our strategies to focus on those social determinants as we understand them, so that we can work with the family through these fictitious kind of continuums that we create, right? But to be with them through that, because once those things are addressed, as Mike said, that actually is a natural prevention, right? There's nothing to go and cycle back through because we've addressed and eradicated the issues that are causing the pervasive disparity or inequity in the first place. Sorry, Mike, I just had to get in.
No, it was great. Thank you. And so when you think of, so what is the approach, right? So the approach to advanced well-being, I kept calling these teardrops. They're not teardrops, obviously, they'd be raindrops. That's why there's a seed growing into a plant or flower, etc., right? And so when you think what we'll walk you through, again, these are what we believe are some key components, or the key components to actually achieving well-being, right? And the part of this is it requires not just systems work, but some internal work that we all have to do. And so when we talk about the mental models and what Sam just uplifted, it's some of that self-work that we all need to sort of own. And and I see you in the chat. And so we just need to be aware of that. So I'm just going to take you from the bottom left, and I'll take you around, but just know these components do not always happen in a linear order, because the first thing adults do is like, give us the roadmap of the exact way we go, give us the exact steps. And if you don't, we get a little stuck on silly and we just walk away, right?
Yeah, and it's important that
Go ahead,
folks can
Sam.
say, like, you may be doing different parts of this, which is great.
Mhm.
Our thing is just like, all of these things need to exist in some way, we believe, in order to get to real transformational change. And so don't think that if you're already at a cross-sector data sharing place, that you have to jump backwards. No, it's like, let's figure out how we can put all the puzzle pieces together and get there. And so like Mike said, while we'll walk you through it in a linear process, this is not a linear process as we do work.
Yeah, and we'll do high level right now, which will just take you through the drops, right? So establish a cross systems collaborative, right? And having, as we all know, right? We just know there are multiple systems touching the families and young people with whom we are working for and on their behalf, right? So bringing new folks into the room. An awareness of structural racism, right? Historical competence, having time for self-reflection. We'll touch on some of these things. Anchoring the work. And this is, again, some of that that person work, right? How do we actually get in a room, have some shared values, build trust with one another? Centering community. So for us, a massive value of what we do is centering the work as much as possible in community. And we'll speak more directly to that in a little bit. Having cross-sector data, right? So exploring, again, the cross-sector nature of all these issues, right? Understanding that the conundrum we mentioned earlier about the lack of flexibility when you think about government, we need to break that down. And then getting to cross-sector transformational change, right? And these ideas around power sharing, district budgeting. And this last piece to develop the legislative agenda, right? And really it's a legislative and a legal agenda. It's really understanding like what are these other things we need to address. And so as you all think about the work you're doing, right? The funding that's coming in, the dollars that were discussed earlier, it's all part of, in some way, legislative space, but to continue to look at these issues with the legislative agenda and what else needs to be moved, changed, tweaked, modified, enhanced, so we can institutionalize this actual process. So when we work in place, and so I just gave you the high level of our approach, which we'll touch base. We'll touch on some of these things subsequently. But when we first go into a place, there's sort of a readiness space or piece that we want to address, right? And look at what's the first step before we think a place is actually ready to dig into this. And so when I mentioned Ramsey County earlier as one of the places we're doing some deeper work in, we went through some of this process, but we're really trying to interrogate all the places we work now to really get a sense of where folks are. And it doesn't mean we don't work. No one has all of this, or it's not about that. It's just assessing where folks are on their readiness, right? So just taking the left to right, a culture of inquiry and vision. We want to be able to work in places where stakeholders who are open to innovation and can articulate the ideas for something radically different. And that's hard, folks. Like we can all sit and do these are our children conference. We can all have a panel that says radical imagination, but to really interrogate those issues and try to get in to figure out, well, what would that actually look like is hard. But I don't mean to, I'm not trying to minimize the challenge with this, but that's something we always look into, culture of inquiry and vision. Demonstrated capacity for equity reform, right? So really we want to understand whether pushing from inside or the outside. So inside out strategy or outside in strategy, are there local champions who are in space available, pushing for racial and ethnic equity and working on these issues? Leadership composition, right? Looking for leaders who have a vision, can articulate that vision, who are courageous, fearless, but also curious and open to a new path. So, because there's this thing where you can be the brash, you can be the person who says the right words, but we really want folks who want to interrogate, how do we do this? And remember the conundrums we mentioned. Government's not just structured nicely to just snap a button, make this stuff happen, right? So we want leaders who really are interested and curious and open to thinking about how do we make actual real change, and which will look different, and it'll cause us all to have to act different. Community engagement, to make sure we're centering the work in community, right? So this is a commitment to engage community partners in an authentic way, beyond tokenizing just a seat at the table, but as real decision makers, right? And so as we think of the child welfare space, when we talk about lived experience, what does it look like to have folks at the table, right? And to have to share power. And that's a different thing, right? And again, I think when we started 20 some odd years ago, the conversation was, well, how do you get a prosecutor and a public defender in the same room? Like, that was the big thing, right? And then it was, well, how do you bring communities to these tables? And people have now moved to do that. But now we're talking about how do we give community real decision-making authority and real power sharing within that context, right? That's the word. So we always look into that. And then political considerations, right? We are in times right now, crazy times right now. There are always crazy times politically, but being aware of what that political climate is in any place where we will go do work. And so just kind of wanted to lay out like our readiness, the factors and the criteria, the characteristics that we look for as we prepare to work in a jurisdiction. Yeah, and so this just gives you, this is sort of our process, but just gives you a sense of, again, another way to see the change we've made. The classic work we did, the traditional work, is on the left, harm reduction framework, right? Very data driven. It's around creating alternatives, right? Which are often can be workaround. And these aren't, and again, we're not saying harm reduction work is bad. A lot of us spend our careers doing that work, right? But the shift is to the well-being framework, is it's facilitating a values-driven process, right? We're basing our work in values. The data is qualitative and quantitative, not just quantitative, right? And it really is about reimagining a cross-system and community-centered response. Community-centered response structured to promote well-being. And so part of why we included this slide was we fundamentally, when we go to groups, this is where we think all groups can shift. You all are facilitating yourselves, collaborators are facilitating all around the country, in every county you all are in, you are planning, you are strategizing. And what we were saying is the shift is not to disregard the sort of classic way we work, it is to incorporate these other critical pieces, right? How do you incorporate values? What is it to have shared values with folks you're sitting around the table with, right? What is it to use qualitative and quantitative, right? To get that other data we often exclude. And what are the things we need to do to really reimagine? And imagine if we were all spending all of this time, our meeting time, or a lot more of our meeting time, really thinking about what reimagining would look like, not just philosophically, but then even the mechanics of what that is. And so again, we just put that in to give you a sense as you all are doing your local work in counties, where we would encourage and push you to continue to shift, if you're not already there, of how you even facilitate and work with your collaborators. And then this is just another one, we just included this. So in a lot of our work, we're in places, and so if you take the Family First Act, right, it's a piece of legislation, right? It has mandates, it dictates, this is what you do. This is how funds can be used. I'm sure, Similarly, when we look at places, we always want to have an analysis of, are they mandated, non-mandated? There are some places we're working in where the work is coming or manifest because there's a mandate to do that work. That's on the left, politically driven. There's power dynamics often. There's reports and mandates. Sometimes there's fragmented support. We found that in a lot of those mandated places where there's mandates to do something, right? That's often, in theory, a good thing. There's accelerated timeline, right? So we've had jurisdictions say, we'll come and fix all of our equity issues and we have 7 months, right? Versus the non-mandated piece on the right-hand side is around, right? That's where ideally we want to go, where it's everybody's at the table because they want to be at the table, right? There's shared values, it's centered in community, right? But there's challenge with that, right? It's slower. Sometimes there's issues around, who's owning the process, and it definitely requires a legislative agenda. But just being aware of these kinds of factors, particularly as you think about the new way that you all will be functioning around this new funding and how that funding can be used differently. And as you get your collaborative bodies together and as you plan and strategize, we just wanted to uplift some of the different ways that this can play out, depending on if there's dictates that drive why you have to do something versus folks coming to the table voluntarily. Different factors to consider. So we just wanted to name those for you.
And so if you remember the drops, the water that was nourishing the plant to grow the well-being, one of them was awareness, right? Understanding the awareness of structural racism. And so historical competence is part of that. And we believe really strongly that it's important for us all to establish a sense of historical competence and really begin to understand the impact of our nation's history regarding race and structural racism. Understanding that really helps us to paint a very clear picture of why things are the way they are currently. And it also gives us the information we need to begin to really disrupt some of the patterns. And so we lift this up because we encourage folks to understand this on a national level, but also take the time to really dive deeply into a hyper-local understanding, like really understand the history of your neighborhoods. And a lot of that history is often preserved orally through elders in the community, and seek them out and really get a sense of why things are the way they are. If there is distrust, what is it rooted in? What are the things that need to happen in order to heal that and begin like a restorative path forward? And so part of what we did want to share with you all is we've created like a short video. We're always trying to come up with various ways to share our understanding of a very complex history. And so we've been challenging each other internally to find different platforms to share that. We have like a training curriculum that, we can walk folks through in a lot of detail, but we're also trying to come up with ways for like other folks, like some of our younger community members to be able to participate. So we wanted to share this quick video with you guys. It's a lot of information, so you'll have access to this and it's online. But just wanted to share it because this is one of our ways of like almost radically reimagining how we can share some of a very heavy history in a way that's digestible for folks.
European settlers arrived in North America, finding it populated with diverse, long-established indigenous societies. While indigenous peoples resisted, the colonial powers seized their lands and destroyed their way of life through acts of genocidal violence. In 1619, the first slave ship docked in Jamestown, and slavery expanded throughout America. Through its brutality and violence, slavery caused generational trauma for families who were forcibly separated from one another and their culture. The 1800s continued the violent assault on indigenous populations as the United States government perpetuated ethnic cleansing with the Indian Removal Act and forced assimilation through the Indian boarding school movement. In 1865, the 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery, but was replaced by convict leasing, which was the birth of the prison industrial complex. Throughout the 1800s and into the 1900s, white citizens engaged in domestic terror such as lynching to continue the social control and racial terror of black bodies. The American eugenics movement was formed during the late 19th century and continued into the 1940s. The movement not only supported the idea of breeding a master or superior race, it established a goal to eliminate undesirable genetic traits typically found in the poor, uneducated, and people of color. Nazis borrowed heavily from America's eugenist race laws and practices. Beginning in the 1970s, the country's war on drugs destroyed communities of color and led to mass incarceration of people of color, with a significant increase for women of color in particular. The fear-mongering in mass media platforms targeted black and brown children, describing them as older, rougher, and criminal-minded, using terms like wolf packs and super predators, which led to increases in arrests, sentencing, and children entering adult prisons. In the 2010s, technological advances and increased access to camera phones and social media allowed communities to shine an international spotlight on the often hidden state-sanctioned murders of unarmed Black and brown people at the hands of law enforcement. 2020 brought the global challenge of COVID-19, but the continued domestic terror against Black and brown bodies highlighted that racism remains America's top pandemic. It also demonstrated the most diverse and unified collection of voices demanding change. In 2021, in the wake of the Capitol insurrection and continued injustice, we have the opportunity to disrupt the legacy of racism. So let's create a post-pandemic new normal that centers our humanity in love, inclusion, and well-being.
Got you. So thank you for showing that, Lydia. That was probably a little bit of, I don't even know how you did that, so appreciate it. So yeah, and just again, just a short video, and again, really for a little bit of a younger audience in the sense of, not that we know how old all y'all are, but again, to let folks just engage these issues. And it really is to start exploring. And so one of the things I would just say in the history piece is what we always tell groups we work with, you know, look at your own local history, really understand why things are the way they are, why people live where they live, right? Because our whole point of this isn't to just be provocative just because, it's just say, like, we need to understand why some of these conditions exist, or some of the factors and the intentionality behind some of it, right? And so just to have that shared understanding within a collaborative, we think is really important. So in addition to having historical competence, right, we think it's really important then to really reflect on our own self-awareness around structural racism, the issues around the structural racism, right? How it exists in our daily lives, in our personal and professional space, because it very much reflects how we show up to work, how we do what we do, how we think about what we think about. So one of the things we often have groups do, we won't have you all do it today, but we'll give this to you and you'll have it. But want to walk you through is a self-reflection tool, so stages of structural racism awareness tool. And so if you remember from those drops, right, one of the drops is around structural racism awareness, right? And so this is one of the ways we think it's important folks can engage that. And I'll just walk you through, and if you look at it's a continuum, and if you look from the very left, we'll start on the left, sort of people who are completely unaware. And so you see the kind of quotes attributed. And for a lot of us, we've heard these quotes, right? So they're not just made up out of fantasy, right? So folks who say, I don't see color, it's about poverty. We use race neutral tools. So we talked about that a little earlier about that, race neutral tools. And then sort of this piece around, I'm not racist, some of my best friends are, and you plug in a category of people of color, right? So that's kind of that completely unaware. And I want to be clear, when we do this, this is not just for white people. This is a tool we really use for everyone to just go through. So I want to put that out there before we go any deeper into this, because we all sort of exist in this continuum and we move depending on the day and the situation. But we think this tool is really instructive to help us begin to have conversations and normalize conversations. So the same way as Sam referenced earlier around structural racism, the normalization of certain things, what we want to normalize is conversations to unpack these issues, right, to get to a better place. So moving to the right, defensive and denial. So this is often someone who will say, I had nothing to do with it, get over it. You know, as we're thinking about disparities as an example, prove it. There's often, people will say, well, I don't believe that, so just prove it. And then I'm not racist, some of my best friends are, and person plugs in a category of person of color. Moving more to the right, acknowledges extreme forms of interpersonal racism. So when you think of the last couple of years in our country, right, this is when somebody can identify and disapprove of a racist person's action. You could see something and absolutely say, that is wrong, that is racist, that is wrong. You can name that. But it will also say, I'm not racist, I am not that, right? Some of my best friends are, plug in the category of person of color. As we continue to move to the right, acknowledges people who acknowledge racism but deny privilege, right? And so this was, the one we just went through and this point where a lot of the public conversation in the past 2 years has been around this, right? So acknowledges racism, denies privilege. This is kind of a classic. My family has struggled. All lives matter. I feel personally attacked by this conversation. And often people will disengage from this conversation because they feel like they're being personally attacked, right? And then as we move to the right, we start to, it's an increased awareness, right? So people will begin to see the structural inequity. And this awareness comes with disappointment as this new reality contradicts my worldview. I feel personally really angry, guilty, and upset. So for a lot, I'm going to make a generalization just for first, and it's my facilitator's license, I'm allowed to, but I don't know you and I cannot see all of you. But just from, I'll use my experience, as a person of color after George Floyd, I had a lot of white partners around the country call, right? And talk about like, this hit a different level, right? Personally angry, guilty. So that's a good thing, right? So there's nothing wrong with that, just saying. A lot of us experience that at different points in our lives as things happen that are in the public sphere. Moving more to the right, connects the dots between inequity and privilege. So now we're getting into my privilege doesn't reflect my morality, but my response to it does. All of us in different ways have pieces of privilege. So it is not about having privilege, right? But it's about what do we do with that? How do we view it? Are we introspective about it, right? And how do we respond to issues that we see? Then moving to the right, as we get to the sort of higher level of awareness, leaning in and being comfortable with the discomfort. Conversations about race or ethnicity are no longer threatening. And now that I see structural racism, I will never unsee it, right? And that just becomes the work. There are things that happen, we're going to address them, we're going to lean in, and those conversations are no longer so painful. They're just conversations about how do we keep moving forward, how do we get better? And then being the change, making the change, right? I understand that we need to close the racial ethnic gaps that structural racism produces and create more equitable opportunity. And so that's the ideal. All of us are never there like every single day because we're not perfect. It's not the point. But it's important that we all own this issue, and we think this tool is a great way to just have people, we'll have people journal this. We always reference, we had a colleague when we first were doing this that she actually put up like a big poster paper like on a wall and wanted people to like kind of mark where they were.
She asked them to do to create human line graphs according to the big map that they, so they had this pasted on the wall as large as the wall was and asked folks to line up in categories of where you fit. We shared that story because it was an epic fail and nobody got out of their desk and nobody wanted to do that because these are very deeply personal issues. But we joke about it now and ask folks to use this and journal and think about it and know that you'll move up and down. And this is more of a game of Twister, not just a linear kind of step forward. But I'm going to tell our colleague that you keep bringing up that example. I don't think they're going to appreciate that.
Nope, she would not. But it was funny. And so again, this is just a tool we think, is just helpful to start normalizing these conversations, which often can be uncomfortable, awkward, hard. But we need to have them. You can go to the next slide. And Lydia, the fact that you're now showing yourself, is that also a time pinch? Want to make sure.
No, you're fine. I just
okay.
Did you want to?
I got used to the cat. I was looking at the cat with the glasses.
The cat is very cute.
Did
you want to chime in, though? Because I saw you also put something in the chat.
I just wanted to add that, it's important that, we all educate ourselves where we need to on this, but also it's our job to do that. And it's not, we shouldn't rely on the labor of other people of color to do it for us. Like,
Absolutely.
Asking them to process like racialized like traumatic events, and be really mindful of that, because I think collectively for some groups, when something happens, like when there is for example, the incident was, or the murder of George Floyd, I know a lot of my non-Black friends went in turn and wanted to process that with their Black friends. And I was like, that's actually really not trauma informed because they're experiencing this. And if they reach out to you to talk about it, then that's that's fine. However, you feel that's appropriate, but it's not appropriate for you to call them to, dump your feelings about what's going on. So I think it's important just to remember that, and remember, that these are traumatic experiences. We need to be sensitive to that.
Yep, thank you for lifting that up. It's definitely like the self-work that we need to do, and then the work that we can do as a collective. But yep, thank you for adding that emphasis on personal responsibility.
Awesome. And we can go to the next. And so for us, and this again was one of the components that we mentioned on the drop slide, but is anchoring the work in truth, right? And understanding we're working within systems that are rooted in oppression and inequity. That was how they were designed. And so a key thing for us is to really look at establishing working agreements, creating our shared values, taking the time to build trust. And really, if you think about it, it's aligning who we are with what we do. So for a lot of us, it's tricky, right? Who we are as a person is not always consistent or aligned with our professional role, which may not always align with the system within which we are working or impacted by, right? And so how do we do that work? And we think the right side of this, right, establishing those agreements, creating shared values, taking time to build trust is a really important part to getting in alignment, right? Getting ourselves in alignment with what we do, really leading with our values and living in our values. And when we referenced the Ramsey County piece earlier, to understand that part of how they got to that subsequent policy change was spending, I think it was 4 months, it was at least 3 months of meetings, cross-sector, including community, to talk about values and to come up with shared values that they could all agree with. And that was a long process, right? It wasn't one meeting, and it was hard conversations.
And it may sound simple to folks to establish shared values, but the real question was to then test how do institutions function and become driven by these values? And it's a real question. We haven't seen that before. So the Ramsey County example is such a good one, because the reason they were able to reimagine that mental model they were holding around safety and eventually getting to a place of no longer doing the pretextual stops was because they did it because they were holding each other accountable to live those values, right? To have those values determine the direction of the work. And it's just such a significantly different way to work that is just something I feel like we have to keep acknowledging and lifting up.
Yeah, it's a muscle that we just, as professionals, it often gets totally trained out of us. It's not something that is prioritized. So just want to underscore that. I'm going to move through because I know we are getting somewhere near time, but you can go to the next slide, Lydia. Thank you. And so, as we mentioned earlier, for us, centering community is a really, it's just a value. It's a critical value for us. And I think the point of this is that last bullet on the left, believing that those closest to the issue have the solution. And so much of what I think we've been trained as professionals is that we're the expert. And what we really talk about is not being experts. We all have experiences. And so really thinking about those who are closest to the issue have the solutions. They have experience, they have ideas. And the work is, how do we power share? How do we bring them into decision making? How do we become comfortable being transparent when so much of institutional power is based on information and who gets to hold that information, right? So really wrestling with that, centering the work in community. And the next slide just speaks to some of these key questions. So as you just think about your local work and what you're trying to do, just some of the key questions we think are important that when you think about centering community. We can go to the next slide. And I won't go through all these, but just again, understanding and centering the needs of those most impacted, right? Acknowledge and navigate differences in and among communities. Communities are not monolithic. Recognizing, I'm going to just pick a few, recognizing, repairing harm, right? Because often there's a whole bunch of harms that happen, And sometimes systems will show up in space, and with no acknowledgement of that harm, you can't move forward, right? And then again, we talk about the authentic relationships, building shared values, and cultivate a space of belonging. It really is like, what is a welcoming space for people, right? Like, how do we get back to that? And so again, and you will, and this, if it isn't in the chat, this will be provided to folks with PowerPoint after, so you'll have this. I saw that come up as a question, so you'll definitely have this to refer to. So just some of the key notions or key things we think are important when you think about what is centering community look like, what should it include? Go to the next slide. And then as we keep, we referenced several times, like just the idea of the cross-sector collaborative, right? And so having cross-sector data to really understand and connect the dots between all these different pieces. So if you start where Sam started, looking at disparities in education, employment, health, wealth, getting that and really overlaying. And what's interesting, we also talk about this because this is not easy data to actually get in a way that is always useful. It's really something you have to do some work to get the cross-sector data in a way that can then become, that you can use to operationalize, right? And so even as we think, again, big picture, why haven't we made change? There's things around just even data and how it's shown and how it's brought out, how it's analyzed, that often is still siloed, just like those silos we spoke about earlier. So for us, it's really thinking about how do we get cross-sector data and really get the truest picture of what's happening in communities. You go to the next slide.
Sorry. Okay. And so this is our, for folks, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Angela Glover Blackwell, who runs Policy Link, also our board chair, also has a podcast of Radical Imagination. I think the list could go on and on. But really, this is a quote that we really love to lift up. And she says that we aren't stepping into the moment with enough big ideas, enough confidence, and enough audacity. And I think Radical Imagination says, what we need now exists in our heads and our hearts. And so we lift this up because we know that as folks are really tapping into some transformational change type of work, that we're better to be motivated than to see seeds of these types of transformations. And so the next few slides, we want to walk you guys through where we have seen just kind of some internationally and some within the US, but things that we see as really like these seeds of transformation, places to keep an eye on, to really get to draw some inspiration from, and also to put out there, we hope this is a bit of a challenge because we would love to be able to feature more groups like yours as you guys advance in the work and the things that you're doing. We're always looking at these seeds of transformation and adding them to this deck so that we can share them more broadly with folks. So we can go to the, we can start to go through. So a lot of folks are familiar with participatory budgeting and seeing how there have been some really amazing bright spots across the country, as well as internationally. One that we like to lift up was done in Boston, where they had a group of young people within community really come together and begin organizing and mobilizing within community to start to establish the priority areas that they were going to focus on. And this was a very robust effort to have young people come in to generate ideas, a lot of community listening sessions. And then young people were able to, they actually set up voting booths. Young people came in, they voted on what were the projects that funds would be allocated for, and then actually voted towards the allocation. So in real time, really fostering that civic participation from our young people who really led a movement and created free Wi-Fi for the city and different things like that that young people really lifted up is just really inspirational. And this whole notion of participatory budgeting and what would it look like to have that level of transparency across all of our budgets, right? In terms of institutions that are providing human services. Just how incredible an idea that is to share the responsibility of allocation of resources to be determined and impacted by those who are actually on the receiving end of these services. So we can go to the next one. The next up is Calgary's first Indigenous court. And so this is in Canada. And just really love to show this because this, as you see in the picture, they redesigned the courtroom to almost mimic like a teepee and how it's a circular structure. Everybody is leveled. The judge is actually part of the Blood Tribe First Nation, and just really love this quote that he said, right? We don't have a word for crime. Our word is mistake. So actually, like, the literal translation doesn't even exist within this community. And so setting this up in a way that, you know, is normalized for folks, and it represents and shares the culture of those that are being most impacted by this system in this particular jurisdiction and area. And so the, you know, the courtroom has this kind of TP setup. Participants sit in the circle, almost like a restorative practice circle, restorative justice. There's an eagle feather and oaths. They have special ventilation so that they can burn sweetgrass as part of their cultural norms. And so just lift this up as this is totally doable, right? I think we think about radical imagination and doing things so differently as if they're impossible. And yet these are some very real, tangible efforts that are happening that we should all know more about. The next one, if we can go to the next slide, is lifting up the Maori tribe in New Zealand. Not sure how many folks are familiar, but in New Zealand, the Maori tribe is the one that is most heavily represented in the disparity data. So similar to how we look at our disparities, there, the Maori community is really ahead on all the really harmful disparity data that we know exists. And so part of this was they did a very significant deep dive into the health disparities. And from that, ended up creating a parallel health system that would be administered by and really focused on the Maori tribe leadership and ensuring that they had cultural practices to help really support the health of the Maori tribe. And we lift that up because initially that was the radical imagination, that they created this extension of the healthcare system in ways that they started to begin to close gaps and reduce disparities of the health disparities facing the Maori tribe. And then soon after, we had to lift this up because now they have one of their main primetime news anchors is a Maori woman who actually has the traditional tattoo markings on her face. And so this is again to show us that, right, like a marginalized group that was almost in the shadows being lifted up and created space for this very inclusionary practice of bringing folks in and then become mainstream, right? It's no longer this thing that is so distinct, so different, but now just part of our community and our culture to be celebrated. And so just lift this up because this was something that we just thought was really exciting to see. We can go to the next one. Not sure how many folks are familiar with Finland's efforts to eradicate homelessness, and just wanted to lift up in one of the most recent publications that came out citing from 2020 was that their homeless population was down to 0.08%. Again, you know how they did that, guys? They gave them houses. And so here, you know, we think about all the things that we need to fix in order for folks to have housing. And here they took an approach that was radically different. It was, no, we're going to give people housing. And then when they have housing and shelter and security, then we're going to work on these other issues, right? And so again, just lifting up some of our common sense approaches that we can almost like overthink a problem and a strategy to come up with solutions. And sometimes it's just tweaking these things just a little bit that can have such a profound impact on our community. And we can go to the next one, which is like my favorite, and Mike is okay. So Norway, guys, there's a prison in Norway and these are all photos of that prison. This is not a college campus or dorm, right? This is a prison that use really the normality principle. And it's really important to lift this up because while this prison is more expensive to actually institutionalize, it has the lowest recidivism rates globally, right? So they have a 20% recidivism rate. And I lifted up a few quotes here that I think were just so profound. They don't have guards in the traditional sense. No one is allowed to sit, like kind of stand up and watch over everybody. You're engaging with folks as colleagues, you're in constant conversation, getting to know people, just constantly working together to see where folks need to be, what things they need to work on. And because I don't have a better term for it, these quotes are actually from the guards, but are not guards because they don't classify that way. from those officers. But one of the quotes was that we don't punish you while you're here. Being here is the punishment. If we punished you for 10 years, who would you be when you leave, right? And isn't that food for thought for us and how we think about our prison system now and how it functions, right? Like what the morality principle that they lift up is that when you treat people like people, you get good neighbors. When you treat people like animals, you get animals, right? And so just thinking about how we approach these things in ways that really need to be centered more in our humanity and less in our notion of, just punishment. And so this last one here is another quote where they were asking like what section were the different offenses in that people were organized by, which they don't organize in a caste system that way. And he says it's not important what they've done, it's the human behind the action that's important. So again, imagine like on your worst day, your worst decision, and you're fulfilling your punishment, but surrounded by people that set up time for you to have your children come stay, a play area where they could play safely and you can still have that, like foster that connection and that joy, to have a space where you're safe and you can actually begin to really work on and unpack some of the things that contributed to some of the decisions that were made that, put you on a particular trajectory. So I just lift this up because it is such a radically different approach to punishment, right? It's really more about restoration, and it's not perfect, but it's so different than what we all have here and what we have been exposed to, that wanted to lift this up as another example of just radically reimagining something different.
And the next slide, this is actually a pre-COVID illustration, right? That Ramsey County, I think we can just say Ramsey now because it's Ramsey County.
Too late.
In St. Paul, Minnesota, that they developed. So we had some time with them where they were just trying to think about, okay, how do we want, when we think about family in need, and you can see the family in need, the very left, sort of in the most insular part of the shapes, right? And then neighbors, then neighborhood, and then sort of the first layer of services, right? And then that outside layer is the sort of more classic services that we think of, right? And so really trying to just keep family in, right? And keep the system touch as minimal as possible. And so part of this is really cool because they've continued to work on this. So they're now developing an alternative to 911 process and system. And that's one of the things this cross-collaborative group is working on. And so it's just, again, to say, part of this was them just sitting and imagining, like us working with them to say, let's, what could we do? What could it look like? And then how do you operationalize that? And that's where they are in the process now of operationalizing. So just wanted to bring that to you all. You can go to the next slide. And this is all, I'm gonna just push through the next few because I know we're near time. But just similarly, Ramsey, it's like the Ramsey show today, not a perfect place, but you can go back real quick. Just the key part of this is government-wise, when we talk about those conundrums and the challenges with government, they went from 20 some odd different agencies and departments to 7, right? To really condense, to make more efficient what they do. You can see they have a health and wellness as part of their budget. When you compare it to safety and justice, it's smaller. And so they just were really thoughtful in trying to put all these different pieces together. So the things that we've been uplifting are all part of, in some way, these shifts, these bigger institutional shifts that they are going through. But part of those shifts are caused because they're anchoring the work and values and really trying to do things in a different way, not just for the sake of doing things differently, but really to have an impact to get toward well-being, right? To get to that state of being where folks really can thrive, and have opportunity and have access to opportunities. Go to the next slide. And the next slide should be more invest. Yes, Rita will be sharing the slides. I know Lydia will be sending those out after this, so yes. Be more invested, which is some work that Sim and our office participated in. And just it's a community-driven participatory grant-making process. And the biggest part of it was they had a grant advisory team that was weighted toward community, right? So it was 2/3 community, if I'm remembering the numbers right, 1/3 traditional funders. And they shaped who would get funded, how would they get funded, what were the criteria. So it looked very different, right? And the whole idea was, how do we get traditional funding to now go to those folks who are the most grassroots, who are doing, you know, the work on corners and neighborhoods that aren't always a part of the tables where the funding flows, right? So really to shift what funding looks like in Baltimore City. And so it was a really powerful experience. And again, community driven, and we saw it, it was there, right? And that's just a real shift in how philanthropy funds and works. Go to the next slide. And then there's just two more. So one, truth and reconciliation. And you can see these, the truth and reconciliation deals with human rights abuses. It's international, so you see in 40 countries, including Canada and the United States. They're community driven, right? So really having communities, family survivors drive the process, steeped in restorative justice, and developing a truth commission, so that some sort of official body tasked with discovering and revealing those past wrongs and trying to develop a way to actually resolve that conflict. We're involved in some of that work in San Francisco where it's occurring, help guiding a process there, but it's happening here in this country, in Philadelphia and Boston, different places. But just another way that folks are trying to get to a better place by dealing with acknowledging the wrongs and then developing some resolution, right? So just wanted to highlight that. And then our last slide in the radical imagination is California based. So just, and some of you are familiar, we're working in Los Angeles where we're guiding a process to replace the youth probation department with a division of youth development, a department of youth development. And there's a similar effort happening, actually, a reimagining on the child welfare side. And so some of this is how do we get everybody to talk with one another. But this is big, just the idea of replacing youth probation with a Department of Youth Development and what that looks like. And so we're in the process now of trying to actually actualize that. And so just know it's happening in your state. And then I'll just reference one last thing is in San Francisco, we're also leading the work. It's not about us leading, I'm just naming it because we're in the work of closing a juvenile hall in San Francisco. And again, and coming up with, okay, you're gonna close that facility, where the young people go, what is the community space where they can be safe, be held accountable, and have the supports they need, but have it be community led. So we list these out just to give you some real examples of actual work that are the seeds of transformation, right? That begin the steps. This is a journey, so you can see this roadmap one more time. Like we've kind of hit these points about historical competence, anchoring the work, establish cross-sector collaboratives, having awareness of structural racism, building trust and sharing values, developing shared language and having space for self-reflection, developing norms and working agreements, centering community in the work, accessing and analyzing and using cross-sector data, right? Power sharing, so sharing power in a different way, considering concepts like participatory budgeting and other things that lead to transformational change. Thinking about that legislative legal agenda. And at the end of the day, right, radical imagination. How do we push ourselves to actually give ourselves to think, how would this look differently? In a way that actually would make sense if we were explaining to people who don't do this for a living, that they wouldn't say like, why do y'all do that? Why is that the way that you all do what you do? They really would say, oh, that makes sense. How do we get to that place of true transformation? So I think that is our last, that's our last slide. So that is our slide. Yeah, and this is just our beautiful picture, our artistry of just, and honestly, like these are things people are like, oh, why are you showing that? But this is what we want the planet to look like. Not in some woo-saw, way, but really when you think of the left side, that othering and moving to belonging on the right, where we're actually showing up with love and compassion and having enthusiastic, welcoming, belonging space for folks, right? That's where we're all trying to go. So just want to leave you with that. And hopefully this was helpful. Lydia, I think we can turn it back to you to manage any questions.
So now we're going to have 15 minutes of Q&A, and we wanted to have you all go ahead and put your questions in the chat. If you wanted to ask the question and then mute yourself, we can do that as well. So if I could just, if you're interested in doing it that way, just go ahead and raise your hand and then we can unmute folks in order. So I'll just give folks a minute just to start putting things in the chat. So just as a reminder, you will get these slides. We will send them to everyone who registered, and will be able to send those to everyone. So I'm just checking the chat for a second. So there's lots of great feedback about, you know, your presentation. Let's see here. Just scrolling through some stuff so I don't want to miss anything. Yes, you'll also get a recording of the presentation. So we will upload it to our YouTube channel, Strategies TA, and we will also send everyone a link to that. So everyone will get that as well. So there is a question from Jennifer who asks, how do you suggest an agency or county get started on this work?
You're on mute, Sam.
Sorry. Yeah, I think there are a lot of starting points for folks. And when we think about cross-sector, whatever groups are naturally coming together and then broadening out to see like who's missing, who needs to be at the table, who do these discussions also need to impact. I think bringing folks together under that and then establishing what it is that you're working towards and in what way. I'm not sure how like start with that beginning. I guess what the question maybe could be elaborated on a little bit in terms of where the starting point is. Because I think sometimes there are a lot of strategies, as Mike said, that are outside in strategies as well as inside out. So what is driven by community and then what meets with local system stakeholders. I think the big point for us is bringing these groups together into partnership to create the path forward.
Great, thank you. And then there's another question from Maria. What barriers do you see or have seen that gets in the way of moving forward with the vision?
You want to start?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just because we're short on time. I mean, I just think it's, you know, it's not comfortable. Like there's no incentive to show up in your professional life and have to deal with either, hey, here's how I am not doing the best I could do, or here's how we need to talk about race, ethnicity, and these disparities, and I have to own some of that. Like there's just not, you know, there's just not a natural, like, oh, let's just go do that. We're not training that way. So I think it's, and folks aren't always good at having those conversations, right? And so that often can stampede, you know, not stampede, can block the work.
Yeah,
I'm trying to be short. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, and I just want to stress, like, coming together and actually taking the time to build the trust in the group. And that's the thing that no one ever has time for. And the work won't move unless you take the time to build trust and really like showing up differently in that way. So talking about how establishing, we like to call them norms and working agreements. How are we going to address conflict? If you say something that actually really offends me, how should we address this? If I say something that really offends you, I have a major blind spot that you need to point out. How are we going to do that? And come to an agreement before it happens, right? Know that you'll get there. There will be that moment that Mike says something that I'm just shaking under the table and need to like pull him up on. As a group, we can say, hey guys, we really want to do this in a way that's for our collective learning. Let's say how we're going to address this. And then let's hold each other accountable to do that, right? To create the space to do that, to grow together and to learn, linking it to our values, just showing up really differently. We just can't stress that enough. I'm sorry, I see hands and I don't want to ramble.
I'm going to unmute Geneva. I hope I'm saying your name. If I'm saying it incorrectly, please correct me.
Oh, that's okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Jenna Balahai. I work in Yolo County Children's Alliance. We are also the Child Abuse Prevention Council of Yolo County. So my question is in two parts. One of it is I work in a space where I feel that people have power. There's a lot of people power in organizing and advocating for issues within communities. But I also see behind the scenes where, you know, electeds always have powers and you have all these special interest groups. What I want to see happen, and this is something I hope I can see happen in my lifetime, is I feel like electeds need to be part of these conversations, and not just elected leaders, but the people that own them. Because what I've yes, what I've noticed in my experience is the people that own them have more say in how policy is determined and implemented. And sometimes I do get frustrated, but I commend you both because this has re-energized me. So thank you so much. And the next part of my question, I think that was a comment, but the next part of my question is regarding reparation. We've heard some murmurs about reparation when the George Floyd incident happened, when he was killed. But I haven't heard anything regarding that anymore. But I feel like this is one trauma African Americans, people of African descent, continue to carry because reparation has never been acknowledged or even supported by our counterparts, because for some reason, if you're Black or brown, you don't deserve it.
Yeah, I don't know that that was a question either, but but I do think that, no, you lift up really good points, and there has to be some point of reckoning. And I think this is, it's a global conversation, you know, both around reparations of enslaved people of African descent, as well as the CARICOM, like the Caribbean islands, and the plan, the 10-point plan they have for reparations, which is a fantastic plan. If folks haven't read it, certainly read up on it. It's awesome. But also, you know, when we look at what's happening right now in Canada with acknowledging the boarding schools and what's happened to Indigenous populations and tribes across Canada, which is the exact same thing that happened here. And we're going to have to enter into that space, right? And really figure out, what does it mean to pay these debts in a way that we know there's never going to be true reconciliation, but there can be the beginning process of some healing, right? And folks feeling that they're seen. And so it is one of the things that we lift up, because we do think the truth and reconciliation process is going to be the closest vessel to get us to a very real conversation around reparations.
It's the same thing is happening in Africa. Africa is also reckoning with that. I'm West African, I'm from Sierra Leone, and you look at England and how we've supported their economy and all the diamonds and everything. It's just, it makes you really angry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel you.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. I think that those are things for us to really consider and think about. There's another question here. How can we engage the most vulnerable populations and those who are most affected by disproportionality in the most effective, equitable way? I think that someone was just commenting that the work we do with the counties, that seems to be the most challenging. And I think one of the things sometimes that can happen is that the burden is placed on the individual's behavior versus really addressing it from a systemic level.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, you know, getting to a place of really asking ourselves, like, sometimes I really bring it back down to, we used to know how to do this. When we were little and played in the sandbox, we were all friends, we understood it. I knew not to throw sand in your eyes. You would tell me not to eat it. Like, we were good, right? Sometimes it's bringing it back to that, like the who, what, where, when, how, and why. If this is the community we're engaging, we should probably go into that community. The community should tell us where we should meet, right? They should set the times that we meet. Do we need to bring in additional folks to help with childcare, with activities, with fun stuff, so that everyone can participate? It's like the things we know and that we put in place when we're going to meet with our families, or we're going to do a girls' night, and what do we need to do for childcare? These are the things we need to do, right? We need to broaden our concept of how we engage folks and stop thinking about who we are professionally is so different than who we we are personally, and bring these tables together, you know, be in community, break bread with community, make it worth their time, right? Nobody has to partner with you. You have to earn that from folks, and we got to show up in very different ways in order to do so.
I think we have time for one more question. So I'm just looking to see if there's any I might have missed. Could you share a bit more about creating a shared vision with collaborative, or actually, you know, I'm gonna go to Anne Marie. Sorry, Sarah. Have her go ahead and ask her question.
So I think exactly what you were just saying, Sam, about meeting people where they're at. And then I think my biggest challenge is that's still us coming in and bringing our own agenda of what we want from somebody. Like, we want to be invited, we want to be included. And maybe those that we are wanting to serve are not wanting that from us. And so, you know, it's, again, it's that hierarchical position and trying to level it out in a way that does meet people's needs by listening. I've thought about even my own role. We are the CAPC leader for our county as well, and I run parent education and mandated programs. My question was actually, I think it was to Michael Williams' comment about the mandated piece, and it's taking and integrating what's already there and interweaving that communal piece that you were just talking about. And can you both speak, Michael and Sam, about how to do that? Because the right people need to have a voice, a true influential voice at that table.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Was that for Michael Finley or Michael Williams? And do I go? I'll let them start.
For you, Michael Finley. I mean,
Okay.
I appreciate Michael Williams'
I'm sorry.
comment. I think you're right. And feel free to jump in too. It's trying to invite without forcing and saying. It's sort of like the unexpected DEI expert in your business simply because it's a person of color. It's like, that's not fair.
Right.
That's not the right way to do this.
Right. No, I mean, I think, you know, getting the invitation in, this is again, like the time it takes to almost reintroduce yourself to community, right? I'll share with you all, like I used to work at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, right? So I feel like I can talk a whole bunch of smack about philanthropy because I was in it before. So no offense to any philanthropists on the line. But it was no mistake that my time at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, a national foundation in Baltimore that had a $2 billion endowment, happened during the time of Freddie Gray, right? I was there during the time of Freddie Gray. And the shame it felt to be in a national philanthropy in a city that was literally burning because of the chronic disinvestment in community when you're in this beautiful building that's in the heart of the city, right? And it was like, we had to really sit down and say, we need to introduce ourselves to community in a very different way. It meant opening the doors and really using different platforms than what we're used to, talking to young people in community to get out there and start doing the cleanup in community after, well, we had an uprising, so there was a lot to clean up, but, you know, being in community with folks. And we used a lot of social media platforms to invite young people in, and the foundation had to take a very different stance. They were no longer going to show up as a keynote speaker. They were going to be keynote listeners. They weren't allowed to speak, literally set up forums where community members came in, and the only rule that we had for the adults in the room was they were not allowed to talk. That was it. They could be there, they could smile, they could eat, they were not allowed to speak. They could note take, right? And young people really got to sit in and start really saying the things that were on their mind. They wanted to know, what are you doing? You say you work in service of me? I've never met you before. Who are you? Right? And it had to be, and it was slow, but it had to start that way. And you know, the best messengers are young people and people in once they real recognizes real, right? That's what young people say. When they feel you are listening to them, that is the advertisement you could never buy, right? Your stuff will flow like fire. You'll start having people swelling in the rooms at so many. All you got to do is give them the space and play a very different role in the engagement.
And just last thing that, because Emery, I feel like that question wasn't so much for you, like you personally, but that's just my guess through Zoom. But for like, you're in a space working with folks, and how do you do that? And at some point, it's very much just, it's, so what Sam isn't fully saying, like, she had those values. She pushed those values. Now, not everybody she worked with at Casey felt those values.
Well,
But
they
it's
all
very
notice
much
that I
on
don't work
us
there anymore, right? They all see that.
right. But her role there was that. But I think the point is, like, you know, to just get back to basics. Like, it's kind of like, you know, we like, if I don't talk to my neighbors, it's a choice. I can talk, I can have a great, I just choose not to because I don't want to deal with them. Well, when we kind of ask, like, hey, how do we engage? It's like, well, when we want to engage, we figure out how to engage, right? And what people are asking about is how do we actually do it authentically? And I think it's like, if we start seeing people as people, it's actually not hard. Because even the concept of like, well, where have we got? Like, there's things that happen in adult professional brains when it's like, well, we're going to meet with community. Like, what does that look like? You just talk to human beings. They're people. We're all people. We all got to buy groceries somewhere. Might be at a different place. You know what I mean? Like, we have to just get back to being people on that very basic level. So just want to reiterate, because I think that's a great question, great point. And Sam's point, it made me just think of that. Like, that sandbox reference. Like, we used to know how to do this. We're in the sandbox and I'm going to talk to you because you have a toy and I want to play with the toy, whatever. So.
Thank you both. I love this sandbox analogy because you're right. It was just inherent. We had to respect one another.
We used to know this. We were taught to unlearn it, right?
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both for bringing this information to the work that we all do in really trying to uplift families and communities. And also, I think just all of the participants for sharing their perspectives on the work. I think that's so important. We all can learn from each other so much. So I really appreciate that. I wanted just to also let you all know that we are going to be holding a clinic, and we're trying to get some dates. So hopefully right after this, we'll be able to give you some more information with the Burns team, and being able to have a little bit of a more intimate gathering to learn more about how can we actually start to do these things in the work that we're doing. What does this look like for my community? Because obviously everyone's county work that they're doing is different. So it'll be an opportunity to learn even more and go even deeper with this information. So we're very excited. I wanted just to bring your attention to the Reimagining Prevention website, which you can access on Strategies as well as the Caltrans website. So you'll be able to see on both websites a link that shows just the upcoming events in the series, as well as the recordings and things like that. You will get an email with everything from today's webinar, but if you wanted to see anything from a past webinar that we just had or anything for the future, please keep in contact. Also, please keep connected to all of us via our Facebook, LinkedIn pages, and YouTube as well. So we just put a survey link in the chat. If you're able to fill it out right now, please go ahead and click on that. You will get a follow-up email from me by the end of the week with all, again, like I said, all of the materials. And then also, please check out the website and the Reimagining Prevention series to register for the next webinar, which is about the comprehensive prevention plan. You'll learn so much more about what that will entail, and really be able to connect that to the work that you do and see where you fit into that. So there is someone who was kind enough, thank you so much, Jagdish, to drop that into the chat for us. So please feel free to do that. It's going to be a jam-packed webinar, so we really want to make sure that you are able to get registered for that as well. So, well, again, thank you all for spending your afternoon with us. We hope to see you again very, very soon. Take care.